everyone, and welcome to this first book launch for a book that is a long time making, and the final chapter is going to be written hopefully soon, but it is a story of great, incredible courage and resilience, and ultimately hope that upon you reading this story, you are going to take the action that is necessary to end one of the most pressing and compelling human rights injustices that we have seen in a long time. And that's saying something considering what we've seen over the last 25 years in the so-called global war on terror. And I think when we hear stories, stories are often lessons, stories are pathways, and stories are about things like responsibility. We tell a story because we are responsible for the contents of that story. In the same way that you name someone or you name something, you are taking responsibility for that. And I think often in situations like this of people who stand out, people who stand up, people like Sally. And Sally reminds me in many ways of an old friend that some of you might remember by the name of Claire Culhane. Claire Culhane was a nurse who went over to heal the wounds in Vietnam of children who were being burned by napalm that was produced in her country, Canada. And she asked herself, why am I binding up the wounds that are being produced by the weapons companies that are profiting off of the burning of children in Vietnam that are made in Canada? I need to go home to Canada, and I need for Canada to take responsibility. And so she chained herself to the parliamentary gallery and she dropped flyers onto the folks down below and said, this is our responsibility. We have got to get out of Vietnam. Stop believing your own press releases about being a peaceable kingdom, about being a global peacemaker. We know the role that Canada is playing in Vietnam, and we've got to get them out. Now, some of you might recall that during Vietnam, many war crimes were committed. My Lai is one of what many said was the almost weekly massacre that took place in what was known as a free fire zone, similar to what we are seeing in Gaza today. And there were tens of thousands of Canadian citizens who took part in the U.S. military invasion and occupation of Vietnam. There was no attempt that we are aware of by the Canadian government to prevent those who were members of an organization engaging in war crimes from returning to this country, which was a stark contrast to the 1930s when members of the MACPAPs, the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, went to Spain to fight against the fascists under Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler. They had to fight the Canadian government for the right to come home because the Canadian government wanted to exile them as so-called premature anti-fascists. You remember the premature anti-fascists. Tonight's event is situated, I think, properly within the context of what we might call the 40-year forever war. And this is a 40-year war from which Canadian companies, American companies, and their diplomatic cohorts have benefited because there's just so many people that can be killed. And this 40-year war is a war that involves Iraq, Iran, Syria, that whole area of the world that has quote-unquote been on fire for so many decades. In 1989, many of you may remember when the Berlin Wall came down, and it was a day of global celebration, except in the offices of Lockheed Martin, Litton Industries, Northrop Grumman, and other arms manufacturers, as well as the War Department and the Pentagon, because, as Colin Powell said at that time, we no longer have the luxury of having a threat to prepare for. Therefore, this means that all those calls coming from civil society, calling for a peace dividend, taking all that money which was going into war and putting it into social services and the kinds of needs that we had as a society, what were we going to do? We needed a new enemy. And who came along other than Donald Rumsfeld's close friend Saddam Hussein, who invaded Kuwait in 1990, and all of a sudden they went to Hill and Knowlton, the advertising firm, and they said, we need some good excuses to ramp this up. So they created the old ripping the babies out of incubators campaign. That was created by Hill and Knowlton, which at the time was led by a guy named David McNaughton, who went on to become the first ambassador to the US for the Trudeau government. And so as that war got underway, Operation Desert Storm, half of the population of Iraq was under the age of 15. Thousands, tens of thousands were killed directly by the bombings, which were done by Canadian fighters, by American fighters, and British fighters, among others, in this so-called coalition. And as they targeted water, as they targeted electrical facilities, as they targeted hospitals, boy, does this sound familiar, they made a complete wreck of a very modern society. And many people within the Pentagon and the State Department essentially said, we do not want a modern Iraq to be shown off to the rest of the world. They were being punished for their impudence. Now, of course, when Iraq was conducting chemical warfare attacks against the Kurds in the north and against the people of Iran, the United States just looked the other way, because there were companies in the United States that were making a profit off of this. From 1991, after the end of Operation Desert Storm, up until 2003, there was almost daily bombing of the people of Iraq. The sanctions, which were enforced by Canadian Navy warships at a cost of over $1 billion, contributed to the monthly deaths of over 5,000 children. It got to the point where if you tried to take pencils, if you tried to take children's toys and books and medicine into Iraq, you would be sanctioned by the US government. And a number of people were indicted for doing just that. And in fact, in 2003, a number of Iraqi Americans were sent to prison for as long as 22 years for what were called crimes of compassion. At one point, the UN delegate to that area who was looking at the sanctions, Dennis Holliday, concluded in his resignation note, I can no longer participate in a genocide. Along comes 9/11, and after 9/11 we see a huge uptick in Islamophobic attacks, in CSIS and RCMP surveillance upon especially young people, but mosques, workplaces, and homes. And we see the beginnings of a program that was rooted much earlier in US history, but which really was ramped up and very specifically targeted against Muslims, especially Muslim men, who were sent to black sites around the globe, disappeared and tortured. And those who refused to cooperate with CSIS and the RCMP were often told, if you don't cooperate with us, we've got some names that you've probably read about in the news, and that's where you might wind up as well. Along comes 2003 and the shock and awe invasion of Iraq. And so Iraq is thrown into this occupation. It is thrown into a civil war. Thousands of people are dying every single month. The conditions that were brought on by the sanctions have never been lifted. And so they have taken a bad situation and making it worse. Now, as the U.S. tried to set itself up as the overlord of this new country, various factions started to get together to resist the occupation, and this unleashed a torrent of hatred and violence, again, of neighborhoods which had traditionally lived together, Shia and Sunni alongside of one another, were suddenly at each other's throats. In 2006, Patrick Coburn wrote that the busiest business in downtown Baghdad was tattoo parlors. Why? Because young men especially were going to get tattoos because if their bodies showed up on the street, having been mutilated by one force or another, they wanted their families to be able to identify them. Some of you might remember Abu Ghraib, the scandal of prison torture, which not only took place in this horrific prison, but was recorded by American troops. They gloried in and took selfies of torturing people, of bringing in dogs, of attaching electrical wires to detainees. And so as you see all of this going on, there's a huge amount of anger, there's a huge amount of resentment, and the whole region is going through a chaotic presence. Now, as the U.S. continued to deal with whether or not it was going to stay, eventually in the 2010s, we saw the rise of a whole bunch of groups that, inspired in part by the Arab Spring protests, were very much inspired, A, to get the US out, but B, to go after their enemies who had gone after them during the civil wars. And it's here that we see people coming out of Abu Ghraib and going right into the hands of willing groups like the Islamic State, which is called Daesh. I don't like to call it the Islamic State because I don't think that's a fair characterization, and it contributes to Islamophobia. So Daesh swept across vast swaths of Iraq and went into Syria. And at first, some people thought this was going to be okay because at least they promised some sense of security, some sense of stability after the horror show that they had been in over the last 20 years. But as we saw, that did not last very long, and horrific brutality started taking place. If you were a kid in Canada or the United States or Britain growing up in this hateful Islamophobic environment where you were not made to feel welcome and safe, and suddenly you see a video that says, hey, come to this Islamic paradise. It is going to be great. They're not sending out beheading videos. They're sending out videos that basically say, you have a place. So perhaps we can begin to understand why youth who have been disaffected here in Canada or around the globe go, maybe it's worth a trip to see what's going on. And others are inspired to go to Syria because they see the utter depravity of the Bashar al-Assad regime. They see the torture centers. They see the Caesar report, which some of you may have seen over a decade ago, of the just unbelievable tens of thousands of people who are being tortured to death, and those who are not tortured to death are killed by the barrel bombs. Who in their right mind and conscience would not think at some point of saying, maybe I can go and help the Iraqi people out, and the Syrian people out of a really difficult situation. And so this brings us to where we are tonight. We are here to look at the story of one man, young man, a very idealistic young man, and the son of one of our speakers and the author of tonight's book, Sally Lane, who's going to tell you about that. But before we get to Sally, I'd like to share with you the story of somebody who is identified at the federal court as FJ. And you're going to be hearing more about FJ from Alex tonight because Alex met FJ. According to the Canadian government, FJ is one of the most dangerous human beings on the planet. She is so dangerous that, according to an assessment letter, quote, she is assessed to adhere to extremist ideological beliefs which may lead her to act in a violent manner that would pose a security threat to Canada, and the government has no ability to ensure that no such conduct occurs. Now that is FJ, and you might be kind of quaking in your pants right now at that horrific description of this single mother who is disabled of 6 children who is currently in a concentration camp in Syria. When she was visited by the United Nations Special Rapporteur, they found a group of children extremely traumatized, in very poor health, and that FJ suffered from abscesses and permanent infection from shrapnel and chemical wounds in the buttocks and the upper thigh area that needed surgery. She had a pass for a wound draining pus, fever, was weak and in pain, in part due to post-childbirth complications, including malformed healing tissues and internal bleeding. FJ is underweight, suffers from anemia, and is underweight with a calcium deficiency. In addition, this alleged threat to Canadian security is, quote, mentally traumatized by the years she had spent in the camps, multiple imprisonments and torture leading to broken bones and sudden separation from her children. She suffers anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. That is who the Canadian government has concluded poses such a threat to this country that she cannot come home. There are currently 24 Canadians, in addition to Canadian children with mothers who were not born in Canada, who are stuck in that same situation, even after 26 of their fellow detainees have come home over the last 4 years. Our first speaker tonight is someone who has been there. While the Canadian government says it's too dangerous to go, he went last summer. His name is Alex Neve. And Alex is a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He's an adjunct professor of international human rights at the university and also teaches at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. As many of you know, Alex was previously the Secretary General of Amnesty International's English branch for close to 21 years. And in this role, he led and participated in 45 human rights research, advocacy, and campaigning delegations to over 20 countries. So when he went to Northeast Syria, he knew what he was doing. His work has focused on refugee protection, armed conflict, women's human rights and gender equality, the rights of prisoners, the rights of indigenous people, national security and human rights, protection against torture, I don't know when he sleeps, racism and discrimination, consular protection, and the multilateral human rights system. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Alex Neve to share his insights into how we have gotten here, what he saw there on the ground, and what needs to be done to end this human rights conflict. Alex.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew, for the kind introduction, and good to be with you this evening, friends. It's quite something to follow that sweeping overview of 40 years of history. Fortunately, I get to focus on a much more limited amount of time. I have a PowerPoint, which unfortunately isn't going to play, so I'm going to kind of talk you through this, and maybe I'll hold it up a couple of times to show you some images as well. You know, to add to the context-setting piece that you had from Matthew, I think the other thing that I'm very aware of is behind all of this is this so-called debate that we've been faced with in society, certainly since 9/11, about the relationship between security and human rights. Right? We're told it's a debate, that they're kind of against each other. It's security or human rights, security versus human rights. This notion that if you want more security, you've got to give up on human rights, and if you're a bleeding heart who's only concerned about human rights, then you have to accept that you're going to be faced with greater insecurity. I'm assuming I'm with a room full of people who reject that notion and fundamentally recognize that the two are integrally related, that we only will achieve true security if we embrace human rights like never before. And yes, that human rights will be fragile and tenuous if security is not on offer. And we obviously had a very volatile period around that debate in the years after 9/11, and with some very significant human consequences for real people and real lives. And I thought, you know, I'm proud of the fact that I sometimes think I hold on to naivete in my human rights work, because a dose of naivety takes you far. I thought that we'd actually learned some lessons. Here in Canada, obviously, we had had significant judicial inquiries, we had had very important Supreme Court rulings, and really kind of felt like we were moving into a different space. Northeast Syria comes along as the test as to whether or not that is the case, and I think you already know from probably what you've heard even before coming tonight that sadly and unfortunately it's a test that we have failed, and failed abysmally. But it doesn't mean that we can't get it right, that we can't have a rewrite, and that we can't move ahead with approaches that are actually going to ensure that human rights is at the center of this. Matthew talked about sort of the rise of ISIS in Northeast Syria and Iraq, and of course then there was the fall of ISIS. Syrian Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, backed very significantly by the US and allies, took on ISIS and won. And in many respects, that's a good thing. Obviously, what was being inflicted on the people of Northeast Syria and Iraq at the hands of ISIS was beyond heinous and horrific. These are the years of the Yazidi genocide, etc. And so then ISIS is gone. The Syrian Kurdish forces who have come together to assume a governance role in Northeast Syria known as the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. I'll just use the acronym from now on, ANIS. Take control. And obviously they're not an independent state. They've not been recognized as an independent state by any other part of the world. But they are effectively the de facto government in Northeast Syria. They wouldn't be able to do so without the backing they get from the US and others. The US has 2 military bases in the region. Our delegation spent some time on one of those bases. One of the huge challenges that they were faced with was, as ISIS was kind of swept from its rule in the area, is that there was over 50,000 foreign nationals who remained in the region, who had been living under ISIS in that region, some for maybe only a few months, others for a few years. There, of course, was a very quick rush, especially in the media, to come up with one narrative to describe all 50,000 people, and they're all ISIS militants. Overlooks the fact that more than half of them were under the age of 16, that it included Yazidi refugees who had fled from Iraq into Syria because Syria actually seemed safer than Iraq, that it included women who had been trafficked into the region and were not there at all under their own free will. It included people who were there not because they were supporters of ISIS, but in fact they were opposed to ISIS, and they themselves had been punished and sanctioned, and we'll hear, I think, a bit about that when Sally tells you about her son Jacques Letz's story. But nonetheless, one narrative prevails, and that therefore comes to shape public opinion as well. So 50,000 people, more than 60 nationalities, including Canada. And we don't have a conclusive tally as to how many Canadians have been there, even conclusively as to how many Canadians remain there now. But we know that it's at one point it would have been at least between 50 and 60. And again, like with the overall population, more than half of them under the age of 16. So what to do? ANIS is overwhelmed with the logistical side of this. They all get rounded up and initially are all held into large, sprawling, and soon very overcrowded detention camps. That doesn't continue for long before ANIS and military forces decide that it's too insecure, too challenging, too problematic to have the men in the camps. So the men and teenage boys are taken out of the camps, family separation story number 1. And from that point on, for many years now, have been held in prisons throughout Northeast Syria. Some of which were prisons and have been revamped and somewhat modernized. Others far from that. In other instances, it's been repurposed, abandoned schools or other buildings that have been used for prisons and detention centers. In all instances, in the camps, in the prisons, and we certainly heard and saw this firsthand when we did our visits, serious concerns about the conditions, overcrowded, very, very harrowing and harsh conditions, major issues around access to food and safe water, very serious concerns about the adequacy or even, in some instances, the total absence of any kind of medical care. Going back to the more than half of them are under the age of 16. While there has been some effort to offer some degree of educational programming, it does not qualify as education. And there's been huge concerns about safety issues for kids who even may possibly go to some of that programming. So kids aren't getting education, and we're now talking months turning into years of kids without getting any education. ANIS has said to the world, we need help. And here's what we propose. To the 60 other governments, they've said, take your people home. This is not our responsibility to bear. These are your people. These are your nation's stories. Your responsibilities are engaged here. They've also said to the international community, how about a tribunal of some kind, an international tribunal that might deal with some of the most serious cases? We know you do that, community of nations, from time to time, in the aftermath of a situation of serious human rights violations and conflict. How about a tribunal that would deal with some of the worst crimes that had been committed by ISIS leaders in Northeast Syria and Iraq? And then they also said to the international community, help us. We're prepared to deliver justice here, but we don't have the capacity to do so. We don't have the resources. We don't have the personnel. So they essentially have put that three-part agenda out to the international community. The international community has essentially said, nah, and has really kind of turned their back on all three pieces of that. So where does the Canadian situation fit in the midst of all of this? Very early on, as ISIS was first defeated, there was a brief period of time where there were some promising signals from the Canadian government that they got it, that they understood that yes, we have responsibilities here. Yes, we are prepared to allow Canadians to come back to Canada and we'll deal with their circumstances here. That didn't last long. And ever since, certainly since 2019 on, we've had a hardline response from the Canadian government that says the last thing they are going to consider doing is bringing Canadians back. They have no obligation to do so, that it's totally up to their discretion to decide when they will or will not assist Canadians who find themselves imperiled in situations like this abroad. And that furthermore, as Matthew signaled in his comments, it's too dangerous for us to send anyone there to help out anyway, so best of luck to them, but there's nothing we're going to do. That's obviously of grave concern given the circumstances, and I keep going back to let's reject and resist that one narrative fits all notion that these are all heinous, ISIS militants responsible for beheadings and horrific acts of terrorism. More than half under the age of 16, don't forget that. But even amongst the others, amongst the women and amongst the men, a whole host of different stories, many of which don't end with any degree of culpability for crimes. But nonetheless, Canada's not prepared to even consider that possibility. So it goes to court, and a number of the family members, including Sally, come together to challenge the government in court. And there was a rousing, very impressive initial victory in January of last year with a federal court ruling that sided with the families and said, yes, this is wrong from a human rights perspective. This violates the Charter of Rights. The Canadian government does have an obligation to assist here and to facilitate the return of these Canadians. He laid out the steps that needed to be taken to do so, and that included that the Canadian government should go or should send a designated humanitarian representative to go on their behalf to facilitate the repatriation. So a group of us who had been following this and had been doing a fair bit of advocacy around it saw that, thought about it, and said, amongst us we had a whole host of different kinds of expertise and experience, in prisons, in the diplomatic world, even in national security circles. We put our hands up and said to Melanie Joly, choose us, designate us, we're prepared to go. Two things then kind of happened at the same time. Unfortunately, the federal court ruling was reversed in a very dismal federal court of appeal ruling, which essentially agreed with everything the government was saying, and this should be of concern to all of us as Canadians, regardless of whether we're likely to ever end up in a detention camp in Northeast Syria. Any of us who, for whatever circumstances, may find ourselves in need of consular assistance and protection abroad, need to know that the Canadian government consistently maintains the line that we do not have a right to that consular assistance. It is totally up to the discretion of the Canadian government as to if or when they will even attempt to help you, whether it's illness, whether you're stranded in the middle of a natural disaster, whether you are imprisoned, whether you're kidnapped and abducted, no matter what happens. And that is what prevailed at the Federal Court of Appeal. The Federal Court of Appeal agreed with the government that there is no obligation here. So that meant that that earlier ruling saying that the Canadian government should be designated a humanitarian representative didn't kind of still hold. At the same time, we also got a response from the government saying, thanks, but no thanks. If we're going to do anything to repatriate to Canadians, it will be Canadian government officials and government officials alone who go to the area and carry this out. We regrouped, though, and thought, okay, maybe that particular reason for going isn't as current, but are there other reasons why it's still compelling and necessary? And it was clear to us that that was the case, that there were very compelling humanitarian reasons. That because the Canadian government has totally abdicated its responsibility, it clearly says it has no obligation to be doing consular work in the area. These are Canadians in incredibly dangerous, vulnerable, unhealthy conditions. Canadian children who are not getting any schooling for years and years, and not a single consular visit, not a single attempt on the part of the Canadian government to look into it, to show up, to see if any kind of assistance or support could be provided, if there's any way they could be bringing in medicine when Canadians may be facing serious ailments that need medication, etc. So there was a compelling reason to be there for that reason alone, a humanitarian reason to see how people were, to see if we could get a sense of what needs were, etc. Even more compelling than that, especially for the families of the men, in many instances there had not even been confirmation of life for many years now. In one instance, as many as 6 years, that a family had had no confirmation that their loved one was even still alive. So if we could get access, if we could get news of even that, wouldn't that be worth it in and of itself? And then our more tactical reason was we wanted to prove the government wrong. They said, you can't do this. It's too dangerous, it's too far, it's too complicated, the logistics are impossible, too many players involved, it's difficult to cross all the borders, you know, there's not really a government there anyway. We wanted to prove that it could be done. So our delegation headed there for the last week of August, and we did prove that the government was wrong. Obviously, we were not reckless. We had a very accomplished security expert who did planning with us in advance and who traveled with us. We worked with an incredibly accomplished local fixer who was an incredible source of advice and guidance to us at every step along the way. So you don't go into this kind of thing recklessly. But you do the planning, you think it through, and we were able to do it without the slightest threat or risk to our safety or to anyone else's safety while we were there. We were able to have significant meetings with numerous key officials within ANIS, within the political administration, within their justice system, and most significantly, we were able to get access to many, not all, of the Canadians who we wanted to visit. We were given full access to all of the women and children who are held in the camp, including, and Matthew signaled this, 3 non-Canadian women who are the mothers of some of the Canadian children. So obviously have a very strong connection. We knew what we were going to hear largely in those interviews, and that's what we heard. We heard very harrowing and heartbreaking accounts of how difficult and fearful life is in the camp. We also heard firsthand from all 4 of those women, the one Canadian woman, FJ, who Matthew mentioned, and the 3 non-Canadian women, about the disgraceful, outrageous Canadian policy that has been put to them, which essentially is, between those 4 women, they are the mothers of 13 children, the oldest of whom is 14. And they have all been told, your children can come home. You cannot. So we, a country that I thought had learned some lessons about how we don't want forced family separation to be part of what we stand for as a country, are essentially saying that to these 4 families. What was really compelling to us was, especially in the meeting we had with FJ and her 6 children, so she's the Canadian citizen, was, and I'm not a child psychologist, but it was so clear that that was a family that needs to be together. The bonds amongst them, and not just the mother-child bonds, but the bonds amongst the 6 children were real, they were meaningful, they were close, they were sustaining and genuine. And it just broke our hearts. It shamed us as Canadians to be talking with her, knowing and hearing from her firsthand how this has been explained to her, that she's been told, if you have extended family, we assure you, we will do everything we can to make sure your children are in the care of your extended family. If you don't worry, we will take the steps to make sure that your children are taken into foster care. But you need to know, the rules, and in this case it's Quebec, are that if after 2 years of foster care you're not able to reassert your parental rights, and footnote, we're not going to let you come back, they will move into the permanent adoption stream. Oh, and one other thing you need to know, you've got 6 kids, they won't be fostered together. You'll be lucky if we can get foster placements for 2 of them together, so the children will be separated from each other. So that's what's being put in front of the women in the camps. We knew it was going to be much more difficult to get access to the men. We had assembled a list of, the Canadian government doesn't provide any of this information, and I'm not even totally convinced they're exactly clear as to how many Canadians remain in Northeast Syria. But we had assembled a list of 9 men. And even before we arrived, the early conversations we had been having with ANIS officials were, oh yeah, the women and children, absolutely, full access. Oh, the men, that might be difficult. So even as we arrived, we didn't know if we were going to be given access to any of the men. And it was, I won't take you through all the diplomatic and political shenanigans playing out on the ground, and what we were doing, trying to mobilize pressure points from outside, from Washington, from Ottawa, from Geneva. On the last day, we were given access to 2 of the 9 men, a man named Mohammed Ali, and then on the last evening, literally in the last few hours before we were absolutely going to have to leave at 9 o'clock the next morning, we were able to see Jack Letts. Mohammed Ali was being held in a maximum security prison. He was brought in shackled, handcuffed, hooded. They sat him down and didn't even remove the hood. I had to ask for the hood to be removed. He was clearly very broken. We were not able to carry out one of the concessions we had made, just because we so very much wanted to have access, was we had agreed that prison officials could be with us. When our overarching goal was to simply get that confirmation of life, that was a concession that we were willing to give, but it obviously meant that the nature of our interviews was going to be very constrained. There were simply questions we weren't even going to ask. There were answers we weren't going to get. And as close as I could get with Mohammed Ali was to ask him some very soft questions about health. And he certainly indicated that he had very serious health problems. I asked if he could tell us a little bit more about that, and he just looked at me and said, "Not here, not now," which of course gives us reason to be concerned about that that's related to conditions or treatment. What he was able to tell us is, so even though he has no access to lawyers, no family visits, he knows nothing about anything happening in the outside world. He's having no consular visits at all, because Canada won't show up even if they would or would not be granted consular access. The FBI has interrogated him 25 times, though. 25 times over the last 6 years, including just a couple of weeks before we were there. UK intelligence officers have interrogated him. Dutch intelligence officers have interrogated him. Apparently not Canadians, though. At least to his knowledge, no Canadians have been involved in any interrogations. And you suddenly realized, well, this was not suddenly, this was dawning on us, but that was the moment for me where I started to say, to the rest of the delegation, We're in the middle of Guantanamo 2.0, but this time it's on steroids. Guantanamo 2.0 wasn't 50% under the age of 16. Guantanamo 2.0 at its most was 780 students, 780 prisoners. We're talking about 50,000 people who are being held in these camps and detention centers. But beyond that, it's the same notion of here is a place beyond law, a place beyond reach of the courts, a place where none of the fundamentals of the rule of law, fundamental justice, due process, are even on the table, even in an imperfect way. There's not even any of those ridiculous status review tribunals they had at Guantanamo Bay where you could maybe try to challenge the reasons that you're being detained. Nothing. But it's a playground for interrogators. I'm going to leave talking about Jack primarily to Sally, but I have to tell you it was a very powerful moment when we had that visit with him. First and foremost, it was so heartening because I know from the conversations with Sally and family beforehand, and we were feeling this acutely, that there was every reason in the world to be very concerned about his health, both physical and mental. And he does have health issues, but it was so reassuring to see him in a good state, able to really engage with us in the meeting. And to just know that he was alive and okay, and to be able to bring that message back to family who so desperately needed to hear that news. But beyond that, he too is trapped in this incredible labyrinth of injustice. No way out. He too has been repeatedly interrogated by the FBI. And he too, as far as he knows, has never been interrogated by Canadian officials. So we've got Canada saying all over the place that these are heinous security risks who we are simply not going to entertain bringing back to Canada, but we're not interviewing them, we're not gathering in information, we're basing that assessment on who knows what. I've gone way beyond my time, so I better wrap up, but let me leave you with this. We've certainly come back with a strong message to the Canadian government, and it's, you know, in many respects, it's, we've had kind of 15 or so recommendations to them, but the two most obvious, urgent, and immediate ones are get someone on the ground tomorrow to do basic consular work. Every single person we interviewed is facing health issues. There's all of those children who are in desperate security situations, who aren't going to school, who are living in fear. There is exactly the kind of work that consular officers are expected and trained to do is needed right now on the ground. And secondly, stop ducking your responsibilities and move immediately to repatriate every single Canadian, no matter what allegations you do or do not have against any of them. Repatriate them to Canada and deal with the cases here. And if there is evidence, legitimate, credible, lawful evidence that bears out bringing criminal charges against any. We heard directly from pretty well everyone we interviewed. Absolutely, we would face our accusers. We deny the accusations, but we would face our accusers. Give us a fair process, give us a place of safety, and we are prepared to do that. So that's the answer here. But August to February now, and there's still no movement, still no repatriation, still no consular visits happening. And so I hope that you will join the thousands of other Canadians who have been raising this concern with the government, who have been pressing for action, because it's an egregious and disgraceful abdication of our supposed commitment to human rights as a nation, and it's left some very vulnerable individuals in very dangerous circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And I think as we go into some pretty heavy-duty times going forward, it's good to know that we do have fellow citizens like Alex Neve who not only have this history but this courage to continually speak up even when the cases are so-called difficult, because ultimately, as Alex consistently says about 400 times a day, these universal rights are universal. They apply to everyone. Now, there are 57 nations who have nationals in these camps and in these prisons, and many of them have taken their citizens home. Kyrgyzstan has taken hundreds of them home. Lots of different nations have taken them home. In fact, Canada funds the repatriation of Iraqi citizens from the camps to go back to Iraq. We have a program spending $2.9 million to repatriate Iraqis. Good for us. That's a good, positive step forward. Let's put some of the money that's currently being used in the court cases into repatriating the Canadians so that they can come home as well. There's a very disturbing pattern in which, Alex was talking about these things being outside of the rule of law. It's only when we try and bring them inside that rule of law, that international rules-based order that Trudeau and Joly and Freeland talk about nauseatingly, endlessly, and whenever that has happened, someone has come home. So in 2020, the family of a 5-year-old orphan, there's a 5-year-old orphan in these camps by the name of Amira. They were trying to get her home. They had to go to court to basically pressure the Canadian government to get this 5-year-old girl home to her uncle. In March of 2021, a 4-year-old child who was with her mom in the camps, she was able to get out, but only because the family initiated a process by which a private citizen, a former U.S. diplomat, actually went and facilitated getting that 4-year-old child out of the area. In 2021, that 4-year-old's mother, again, went through the same channels, had that former U.S. diplomat assist in getting her out, but once she was out and in Iraq, the Canadian government refused to issue her the travel documents to get her home, and they only did that under the threat of putting this in front of a court. In 2022, Kimberly Pullman, who was a very well-known individual in the camps, she was brought home. She was part of what's known as the BOLO lawsuit, Bring Our Loved Ones Home, and there were 3 others who were brought home with her. And in April of 2023, 14 women and kids came home, again, because on the eve of that decision that Alex talked about, the federal court decision ordering repatriation, I think the government was so afraid that everyone would be ordered home that they struck a deal the day before the decision came out to say the women and kids can come home, but not the men. And so they struck that deal. And all of those 19 have since come home. So we are in a time when Shireen Razak, who's a brilliant writer, she wrote a book called Casting Out. She talks about how Muslims have been cast out. They have been cast out of the realm of law, of the realm of decency and human rights, and put into these lawless zones through legal processes. It's just enough to absolutely play with your head. Someone who has dealt very personally with being cast out, with being demeaned and monsterized by the Canadian government is here with us tonight, and I'm very grateful to have known her for many years. Dr. Monia Mazigh, who many of you know, was born and raised in Tunisia and came to Canada in 1991. She speaks Arabic, French, and English, and she holds a PhD in finance from McGill University. She's worked at the University of Ottawa and Thompson Rivers University. She ran as a federal candidate for the NDP and gained the most votes of any NDP candidate in the history of this riding, and with good reason. And she's also the author of 5 books, a number of which are here tonight. Hope and Despair, My Struggle to Free My Husband, Maher, Arar, Mirrors and Mirages, Hope Has 2 Daughters, Farida, and her most recent title, Gendered Islamophobia. Monia has been a constant and tireless voice for human rights across this land and around the world for decades upon decades. And Monia understands the universality of those human rights because earlier last year, when we were doing a series of book readings for an indigenous woman who was being threatened with being sent to jail for 61 years for trying to protect her child from an abusive father, Monia stepped forward immediately and got right into it. You know, even though it was not related to all of these national security stuff, Monia was there for that. And Monia is here tonight and has been a steadfast supporter of Sally and the detainees who are currently held in Northeast Syria. Please welcome Monia Mazigh.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for introduce your beautiful magistral introduction this evening. I guess all our students in universities, all our Canadian citizens need to hear that. It should be broadcast because a lot of what we are doing this evening need a historical context, and you have done it very well. And Alex, also your introduction about your delegation and the work that you have done in that area, the condition people are living over there, the horrible condition, everything Canada advocate on around the world, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in Asia, whether it is here even in Canada, health, education, women's rights, are a big failure when it comes to what's going on in northern East Syria, and
that's a good tweet.
And basically, it shows the hypocrisy, unfortunately, that we are surrounded by every day. And this hypocrisy, thanks God, it is being exposed more and more. I think in 2002 or immediately after 9/11 in 2001, and more precisely in 2002 when my own story started, I think I lived at that time, up into that time, in this myth of, you know, Canada is a land of immigration, it's a country where, of human rights, where you know, there is somehow equality, some justice. I think it is, yes, probably true, but only for some. And only because of what we are talking here today, because you would wonder why these people who are Canadian citizens, why they are prevented to come back to Canada. Other people, I mean, the issue of dangerous situation, Alex and this delegation were able to go there. There was not something more dangerous than usually conflict zones are. So why? I was wondering while sitting here and listening to all this, why are we refusing any rights to these people? And you can maybe help me by thinking about that, but for me, it has a very, very simple, and I don't want to be simplistic here, but the first thing that comes to my mind is that because they are Muslim. It is because they are Muslim. And maybe we don't want to hear this, and I don't want to, you know, reduce the complexity of their identity, whether they are male, female, education, you know, speaking another. But if there is a simple, if I'm explaining this enigma to a 4-year or 5-year-old, and he would or she would ask me why, I would say, sorry, it's because we live in an area where being a Muslim has been demonized, has been really, you know, remember, what's his name? Bernardo was about to get parole. And there are people who are being in jail for years because of the anti-terrorism legislation, who do not even committed any crime. I'm not minimizing. Maybe they have been involved with some problematic, you know, plotting whatsoever, but they did not kill a human being, which is, I think, the most despicable crime that we can have on this earth. And still, they cannot at all dream of having a parole. And the minute there is just, you know, the lightest maybe possibility that they will go on parole, you would have the official opposition and the government and the opposition and everybody coming out to say, how dare you, and how we are being infiltrated by the terrorists and how we are soft on the terrorists. So personally, I know you are smarter really than this, but I think there is a very simple reason here, and I blame it, or I put my finger on it. These people are Muslim. And I read, not all the book because I'm still working on it, your book, Sally, and I think many, many times you were saying something like, if this happened to us, and we are not, because she's talking about what she has endured since her son has been, she started saying, now I understand how other people who are Muslim are being treated, because they even come after us, even though we are not Muslim, just because our son, you know, decided to go there. And so I think we are somehow, unfortunately, in an era, and I think we entered it. You mentioned the first Gulf War. I think, yes, that's a very really like reasonable maybe point in time to talk about this sort of a new order to the world. But also maybe in Canada, if I want to talk here more closely home, yes, in Canada, and as far as I am concerned, as an immigrant who came to Canada at the same time of the first Gulf War in 1991, I have seen that shift into how I am treated, how I look, I am perceived, how they talk about me, about my religion, about people who look like me differently, I think, after 9/11. And when I talk about that, it's not just, you know, benign sort of racism. I wouldn't say racism is never benign, but, you know, it's not really about I would say isolated incidents, or it's more about, you can see the structural Islamophobia. What does it mean? Two things. For men, and we talked here about cases of men, for men, Muslim men, they are actually described as they pose a national threat, a threat to the national security. So that means if you are Muslim, if you go to any sort of, let's say, paintball, gaming with your teenager friends or your young friend, then you are being really training for military, gaining some sort. This is, and these are not something I am making it up. They are cases of people who have been interrogated, arrested, entered into a list of suspicion because of these sort of paintball, whatever activities. If you are a man, and we have that very known case of, sorry, his name slipped me. I will remember that. The case of if you let's say play any martial sort of arts, you know, sports, that also mean that you are somehow either, that's Adil Sharkawi, yes, I think it was one of the suspicion they had on him, because he was, and Adil Sharkawi is one of the 5 men who were served with, you know, the security certificate. I mean, this is another also structural system that came to be really enforced and used after 9/11, existed before 9/11, but became very much used against the Muslim man to create this idea of, you are a threat. You represent a national security, a threat to the national security. So I think I was mentioning how this structural Islamophobia is going to be how it looks like. So on one hand, we have the demonization, the securitization of these Muslim men. Not all of them, but it's like classification, right? Depending on who you are, what is your level of education, who are your friends, what kind of activity, what are your level of practicing, whether you are super religious, not. So all these kind of things are going to be also part of the creation of this threat that is going to be somehow followed upon on a legal framework. So there are the prison, Guantanamo, we were talking about Guantanamo. We had our own Guantanamo here in Kingston, right? This is where those people who were, who got arrested under the security certificate spent years over there in total, like, you know, confinement, isolation. So we are not, it's not Guantanamo, it's not only on, you know, in the south of the United States, it's not only in today in northern East Syria. We had some kind of a version here with the approval of our government, with our own taxpayers funding those buildings and funding those initiatives. So this creation of the threat can be your neighbor, can be, you know, any person who is maybe look different, look like Muslim or is Muslim. And I think this is one thing on when it comes to men. I'm trying here to summarize because we would love to hear from Sally. So I'm gonna finish on the other point is about women. Because yes, we talked about mainly men, about the threat, the camps, but we heard that in the camps, half of them are children, but also many of them, I don't know exactly the number, many of them are women. And we heard from you, Matthew, and confirmed by Alex, that one of these people, I mean, at least 3 of them are these 3 women. One of them is a Canadian citizen with 6 children, and the 2 other who are not. So again, when we are advocating on behalf of women's rights, of children's rights, as if these kids and these women do not really fall into our advocacy and do not deserve, they are not women enough, they are not children enough. So there is something preventing our rights to reach them. And for me, it's like probably because they are Muslim and they come to really represent another type of threat. So these women, I mean, with all the health condition that you are naming about what is the threat. So for women who probably do not believe or think that she cannot come here, she does not have, maybe she's raising her children on different values, or I don't know what are the reasons, but that create of her a pariah, that create of her another sort of a dangerous person according to the government. Maybe many of you do not follow what happened in Quebec, but just to let you know, from roughly 2006, I would say 7 and 8, until 2015, for over 7 years in Quebec, the question of Muslim women, what they wear, what they don't wear, how they look, how, you know, how probably, you know, oppressed they are, or how, you know, liberated they can be, has been all the time in the front line of the newspaper. And that's also have been on here in this part of Canada, in the rest of Canada. Remember 2015, we had a federal election about the niqab. Yeah. Just a whole, I don't know, 8 months about a garment that not a single journalist in Canada know how many women in Canada wear it. And probably not even a couple of hundred, you know. So this whole idea of, you know, the otherization of these people, you know, they are not like us. they are dangerous. They have another ideology. They are brainwashing their kids. You know, this is why it is okay to leave them over there. We don't want them here back. So I think this idea, unfortunately, we don't talk about it enough in the media. We don't really hear it a lot. And this is why many Canadians do not really know about. And even if they know, they said, well, you know, they are not like us. Maybe they don't deserve to help them. And this is where we are. We are in a situation where we lost somehow our humanity, because our humanity, it's not really about whether you look like me or, you know, you are nice to me or you are, no, it's about I respect you, respect me, and whenever I see that you are really in trouble and nobody is helping you, this is where I step really, you know, in and help. So this is where I want to stop here. It's been really important to have this conversation because it is in those moments of despair. It is in those moments where we would think that we lost really this humanity, nobody. This is where we are going to find something in common. This is where we are going to find really, you know, hope. And this is where, you know, a bunch of us are going to come together, and people like Alex going over there do not really get scared, do not get discouraged, and still keep, because when things are okay, we don't really need those delegation. We don't really, you know, if every children is being fed, every woman is being, you know, treated well, why do we need those rights? We need them for the most vulnerable of us. And I think we have to keep this in mind. These people, even if we, you know, don't agree with whatever, you know, why they went over there, even we are not, you know, they have actually a right upon us to help them come back and, you know, be treated as our friends, our relatives, and to be treated accordingly to the law. Right now, the Canadian government want us to believe that they don't even deserve to be treated as citizens. So thank you so much. I really look forward to hearing Sally and talking about, because her story is really important for all of us, and to make us back again believe in the rule of law, believe in human rights for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monia. And in reading Monia's book, Gendered Islamophobia, it's such a human story. I learned so much, Monia, reading your book, and much as I admire and respect you, it just, you know, the things that you've experienced firsthand, I find it incomprehensible that we as a species treat each other in such a way because of who you are. It's sickening. As Monia was talking tonight about the fact that we are dealing with people who are being treated differently because they are Muslims, I'd like to ask you if you ever heard of the two Mohammeds who were held overseas and that the Canadian government came to the rescue of. Perhaps you didn't, because their name wasn't Mohammed, it was Michael. And the two Michaels were held in China. And within 2 weeks of their being detained illegally, which was wrong, the Chinese government was wrong to detain them. They were being arbitrarily detained on specious allegations. The External Affairs Minister of the day, Chrystia Freeland, said, "We will fight tooth and nail, do everything in our power to bring our Canadians home." She led an international global effort for ending state-to-state arbitrary detention, which was just celebrated on a 3rd anniversary. But she somehow forgot to bring home from China a man by the name of Hussein Jalil, who has been detained illegally in China since 2006, 18 years. Hussein Jalil is a Muslim. Our speaker next is someone who I first communicated with in 2018 after I heard Jack's father being interviewed on CBC. This was around the time that Jack's citizenship was being stripped, and his parents, John, his father, and Sally, his mother, were facing up to 14 years in prison for violating anti-terrorism legislation for attempting to send money to allow her son to escape from Syria and come home. So imagine being under that threat. And Sally did respond to me, but very, very kind of cursorily, I should say. I think you thought at the time I might have been working for CSIS or M15, I'm not sure. But
I was convinced you were MI5.
MI5, it's usually a far more dignified thing than CSIS, so
The truth comes out!
I do appreciate that. Thank you very much, Sally.
Very deep undercover.
Well, thank you. Sally realized that the struggle to free her son, especially after his British citizenship was stripped, was here in Canada. And so in 2020, just before the pandemic hit big time, she boarded a freighter and came across the Atlantic Ocean. I will leave the details of that very interesting trip to Sally, but imagine why someone like Sally, instead of just, booking a ticket on Air Canada, felt that she had to get on a freighter. Well, perhaps you've heard of something called the no-fly list. And so I'm so grateful that Sally is in Canada, and I was able to meet Sally courtesy of Monia, because Sally had met Monia, and we were able to reconnect. And we reconnected by phone, and then Sally said, well, I've got this manuscript, and I said I would love to read it. So before we ever actually met in person, I was able to read this beautiful, rich story, which made me laugh, it made me rage, it made me cry, and it made me want to meet this young man by the name of Jack Letts, because I thought, he reminds me a little bit of what I was like at his age, wanting to go to Central America and work with the victims of the U.S. war against the people of El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras. And I thought there's a bit of Jack in all of us who, as Paul says, you go on journeys. And those journeys can be fascinating, they can be fun, but sometimes you can get a little bit deep in when you are in on those journeys. Sally's not seen Jack in 10 years and has been fighting those 10 years to bring Jack home. Sally should not have to be here tonight. Sally should not have to be giving press conferences. Sally should not have to be telling the story again and again and again to members of Parliament who ask the same questions again and again and again. And imagine the trauma that Sally carries with her. Imagine the pain and the frustration and the sadness and the rage and all of these emotions, and she has to perform a public role to get the government to pay attention and bring her son home. So it takes a lot of courage to do that. It takes a lot of strength to do that. And every day that I work with Sally, I am in awe of that strength and courage. And I'm just really grateful that we are working together to bring Jack home, and we are going to bring Jack home. Sally's going to come up here and do some readings now from Reasonable Cause to Suspect. And the first reading sets the scene of two very different worlds. There's Sally living in Oxford with John, this is this university town in the UK, and there's her son in a Syrian detention facility in Northeast Syria, and looking at those two worlds. Please welcome Sally Lane.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. I just thought I'd start off by telling you how I came to write the book in the first place, and I wrote it a little bit like a diary. So if it seems like a first draft, that's because it is. So I started in the middle of the story. We had just been charged with sending money to Jack to allow him to escape Syria. in the minds of the government, this was money that might be used for the purposes of terrorism. And my lawyer at the time, we were facing the prospect of going to prison. He said, you should write this all down. And I thought, oh, no, nobody wants to hear this. And then I thought about it, and I thought, I will. And so I started writing it. And in a way, it started to become a bit of trying to make sense of things myself. Because this awful thing had happened to us. Jack had gone to Syria at the age of 18. That was in 2014. And our lives just completely turned upside down. We then found that we were the subject of an investigation by the police. They were saying their explanation was they were trying to stop us from slipping into terrorism ourselves, which is nonsensical. Obviously, you don't slip into terrorism. It's not a banana skin. And so what I did was I started in the middle of the story. I went backwards to how did we arrive at this point? How on earth are we in this position? To then being in the midst of things, as things are going on with the police, with the Prevent charity, with trying to contact people, everybody we went to for help. It's unbelievable that in a world of 7 billion people, you can't find one person to help you. Which is why I'm glad I came to Canada. And then I have 3 people, and now you're listening to me, so there we are. Then what I did was I went forward to when we actually had the trial at the Old Bailey in London, where the government was trying to put us in prison for 14 years for trying to rescue our son. So the first reading is from the introduction. So it just explains where Jack is, really. So soon after being captured by the YPG, which is the Kurdish People's Protection Units in northern Syria in May 2017, our son Jack Letts was kept in solitary confinement in a cell he described as a dungeon. There was no ventilation and only a tiny window with 2 layers of bars at the top of the wall. It was here that he spent 35 days with only his brain for company, fearing he was going insane. Abandoned by both his governments, he was a dual British-Canadian citizen and believed by the world to be a fearsome jihadi. Based on a sensational-seeking media that printed lies and assumptions, Jack was trying to come to terms with his fate. This sounds weird, he told a Canadian consular officer 10 months later in January 2018, but in solitary, I wrote letters to the management. The last one I signed with my own blood after scratching my face, thinking someone is going to listen. But no one listened. I knew I was going out of my mind. When Jack was first captured, he was allowed to speak to us, his parents, via a phone app for half an hour every other day. It was then we learned that initially the Kurds had treated him well, offering him cigarettes and telling him that they were negotiating his freedom with Britain. They had their own spies in Raqqa, they told him, who had reported back that he was one of the good guys. They knew he had stood against ISIS, even refuting them in religious arguments in the street, which is very Jack, I have to say, right outside the police station, and told him he would be freed in 3 days' time. That was in 2017. So how did any of this happen to a bright, lively, linguistically talented teenager from Oxford, only 18 when he went to Syria, who had a love of the Arabic culture, language, and religion? Astonishingly, even a YPJ fighter, one of the Kurdish fighters from the Women's Brigade, whose childhood friend worked in the prison Jack was in, and with whom I was in sporadic correspondence, described him as charming. How could it be that he went from being the class clown with a sense of fun and a wide circle of friends to being the world's most wanted in the space of under a year? As Jack's parents, his only supporters, apart from a small circle of friends, we were prevented from running a full-scale public campaign to negotiate his release by strict contempt of court rules. In January 2016, we had been arrested under a charge of fundraising for terrorism after we tried to send Jack £1,000 to escape Raqqa, Syria, with the help of a people smuggler. 3.5 years later, we were still on bail, and newspapers and broadcasters were threatened with a hefty fine for contempt of court if they published anything revealing what we knew about Jack's activities in Syria. Ostensibly, this was to prevent the possible prejudicing of a jury in our forthcoming trial, although the newspaper stories about Jihadi Jack had done that very well already. In actuality, the threat of contempt of court acted as a gag order on us so that we were unable to defend Jack against the lies that had been circulated about him or campaign vigorously for his release. Eventually, securing a meeting with the Foreign Office in June 2017, after screaming uncontrollably down their emergency phone line, I asked the head of special cases how he would feel if it was his own son. I can see that it is very distressing for you, he said. And how would you feel if it was your own son and you were faced with someone like you? I pursued. At least you would know you had done all you could, was his reply. The head of special cases was wrong. We were nowhere near saying that we had done all we could do. Our battle for justice for Jack had just begun.
Sally, in the book you talk a lot about the absurdity of anti-terrorism laws and the broad sweep of them, and we've heard a lot about that tonight from Alex and from Monia. And I'm just wondering, there's a lot of food stuff in your book, and it reminds me of British TV shows where people are eating and drinking well. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how that works, for example, if you're a kebab seller in Raqqa, and how, your understanding of your relationship with the police.
Okay. Yes, yeah. There's a kebab story and a cheese story. I assume we might get to the cheese story later.
Yeah.
The kebab story is part of a discussion that we had with counter-terrorism police who used to come to our house. They just used to pop in for chats. And so we would serve tea and panettone, and we would chat about things like, what is a terrorist? What is a freedom fighter? What's the difference between the two? We even had an officer who said that he gave his opinion that the definition of a terrorist can change according to political circumstances, and that tomorrow's, I have to get this right, the right way around, today's terrorist can be tomorrow's ally. Which is a strange thing for a policeman to say. At the time, we were very naively believing that the police were helping us bring Jack home, and that we had an agreement between us that we had a two-way relationship. And so they would tell us what they knew about Jack, where he was, what he was doing, if he was okay, and we would tell them what we knew. Well, that only ever was a one-way conversation. It was only us ever telling the police what we knew, thinking naively that they were trying to help us. And of course, you know, we realize now that these chats were them gathering information in any way they could. Reasonable cause to suspect is actually wording from terrorism legislation. Which means, so if you're sending money to Syria, if there's a reasonable cause to suspect that it might be used for terrorism purposes, you can be convicted. And so that was the charge. And it's an objective interpretation, not subjective. So meaning if there is a sort of, it's also grounds to suspect. So if there's an objective reason that the money might end up in the wrong place, you can be convicted. And it's actually based on money laundering. Believe it or not, it's based on money laundering legislation, because terrorism legislation was rewritten very hastily after 9/11. And it was written within a 3-week period. And so what do they use as a template? They used money laundering legislation, and the idea behind that is someone who knows the goods are hot, is guilty of money laundering. But there is also, they ought to have known. So if they didn't know, they ought to have known. So that's what reasonable cause to suspect means. So it's quite difficult to get your head around, and we did go all the way up to the Supreme Court in Britain to challenge this, the wording of the legislation, and unfortunately we lost. So the objective interpretation of that phrase still exists. So, over tea and panettone, as with all our other informal chats, the detectives John and I discussed what reasonable cause to suspect actually meant. The police's contention was that Jack was a suspected terrorist because he had expressed a number of anti-Western government views on Facebook and was believed to be living in Raqqa, the Syrian capital of the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, the self-styled caliphate commonly referred to in English as ISIS. John and I didn't dispute either of these contentions. It was what they amounted to that formed the crux of our difference of opinion with the police. Are you saying that anyone living in Raqqa is guilty of supporting ISIS? Asked John. Does that mean that it is actually impossible to do humanitarian work if you're living in the city? Yes, said Detective Sergeant M. If you're living and working in the city, you are by definition supporting the state by paying taxes and by participating in the caliphate. What if you're a kebab seller? Continued John. And you've been living in Raqqa all your life and you pay taxes on your kebab business, and perhaps on a this is very John, sorry. And perhaps on a Friday you give a free kebab to an ISIS fighter just to keep in with them so they don't target and murder your family. Is that considered supporting the state? Yes, said DS, Detective Sergeant M. Absolutely. What else is the kebab seller supposed to do? John pursued. Like Jack, he could never be accused of dropping an argument. He doesn't know anything else. He could get a job, said M, or move. But tens of thousands of them are trying to move at the moment, I joined in, and Europe won't let them in. What about a doctor doing humanitarian work in Raqqa, asked John. Is he a suspected terrorist? We didn't know it at the time, but a British trauma surgeon, David Knott, who had operated at gunpoint on an ISIS fighter in Aleppo in 2013, was similarly called upon to justify his actions in June 2016 by Kirsty Young on Desert Island Discs. When asked whether he should have saved the life of an ISIS fighter, who would no doubt go on to take many more lives, David Knott replied, there was a chance that the fighter would have a change of heart because his life had been saved. Additionally, of course, Dr. Knott had had a gun to his head throughout the whole operation, so had not really been in a position to calmly debate the ethics of his situation. Yes, he would be considered a suspected terrorist, said M. Much later, i.e. more than 3 years after this particular conversation with the counter-terrorism unit, John discovered that this was indeed the case. At the promotion of Dr. Knott's book, War Doctor, Surgery on the Front Line, at the 2019 Oxford Literary Festival, John managed to have a chat with the heroic doctor himself. Despite the fact that by this time, Knott had been awarded an OBE for his courageous wartime surgery, he revealed to John that he was on a police list of 4,000 terror suspects because he had spent time in Syria.
Wow, amazing. Sally, you mentioned Jack's Facebook posts, and when you Google Jack Letts, you might be under the apprehension that Jack is someone who has said some pretty horrible things on Facebook, and that he has also given a series of interviews in which he's also said some pretty distasteful, to say the least, things as well. And I'm just wondering, for the folks who are here, and I know you address this in your book, if you can speak to the genesis of those Facebook posts and the context for the interviews that Jack gave.
Yeah. It's those Facebook posts and Jack's interview that he gave to ITV and also BBC that formed the crux of the evidence in our court case. As in, the police were saying, you ought to have known that he could be a suspected terrorist. And so the Facebook posts, Jack's account was hacked, which was very obvious to us. And also Jack himself managed to say publicly in an interview that he had very stupidly given his password to an extremist who then used it, passed it on to others, and those were the posts that had expressed violent sentiments, which, you know, was just not Jack at all. I mean, we could tell by the spelling, by the phraseology, and it was actually just a 2-week period where that happened, and that was when Jack had just moved to Raqqa. We only found out the circumstances of why he moved to Raqqa much later on, and that was because his house suffered a hit, a missile hit. He said that he was standing by the wall reading a book. By pure chance or luck or divine intervention, you know, whatever your creed, he moved over to the other side of the room, and where he had been standing was completely destroyed and obliterated by a missile. He said if it had been 10 seconds later, he would have been flour. So that's why, so his friends bundled him up and drove him to the nearest hospital, which was in Raqqa. He'd been living in a tiny village up until that point. And once you're in Raqqa, it's impossible to leave. And so some very strange sentiments, things that Jack had never expressed before, suddenly were appearing on his Facebook posts. He'd also never posted publicly, funnily enough, until that point. It had always just been private messages to us by Facebook. And in fact, at one point during that period, I received a message, a private message via Facebook telling me that Jack was dead. And then 3 weeks later, Jack is back chatting to me as normal. So it was very clear other people had access to his account. Unfortunately, I was never able to get that context. I tried to say this in the court. Well, I did say it in the court, but it was never recorded in the press. So people have never known the context behind that. And then with the interviews with the British press, again, people don't understand the context of that, in that it was obviously a coerced interview. He's speaking in a prison cell in the presence of an armed guard who's masked. He managed to tell, there was one lawyer, Clive Stafford Smith, who managed to see Jack about, I suppose, probably about a year after that interview, and Jack explained to him that he knew what he was supposed to say. He had been interrogated before that interview. He knew what answers he was supposed to give, and that nothing of what he had said was true. This evidence has now gone into our Canadian court case, but whether that will, it has never gone into a public arena. Although interestingly, there is a comparison with the Ukraine. One of the journalists who did interview Jack in prison said in the context of the Ukraine that it's actually unethical and illegal to interview people in prison because of the coercive conditions that they are under. And in the case of British soldiers who were imprisoned, they were captured. They were British soldiers fighting in Ukraine against Russia. They were imprisoned by Russia. They gave an interview during that time, and again, clearly it was coerced. They said the war was Ukraine's fault, that Ukraine was deliberately targeting civilians. Nothing a British soldier would say. In that case, the British government explained to everybody that, of course, this is nonsense, it's a coerced interview, and they told YouTube to remove the footage, which they did. So there you have two very different situations. In Jack's case, it was assumed that everything he said was the gospel truth. in a columnist interview.
Yeah. We had a couple more readings, Sally. One of them is the first time you heard that Jack was in Syria, and I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing that story from the book?
Yeah. This is when we first found out in 2014 that Jack was actually in Syria. The police at the time, well, from that point, we're trying to prove that we'd known about it all along, that we encouraged him to go, which would have been a crime because we didn't report the fact to them initially as soon as we found out that he was there. Anyway, so this gives the lie to that police contention. This is September 2nd, 2014. In the early evening of September 2nd, 2014, I was alone in the house when the phone rang. As I answered it, I could only just hear Jack's voice above the very loud crackles on the line, as if he was standing in the midst of a violent gale. "Mum," he said, "I'm in Syria." I began screaming at him. "You promised you wouldn't go. You'll get killed, you'll get beheaded. What the hell do you think you're doing, you stupid, stupid boy?" Jack never replied to any of my questions as the line then went dead. He didn't contact us again for another 3 weeks, the worst 3 weeks of my life. After this short and horrifying conversation, I couldn't contact John as he didn't answer his phone, so I contacted Jack's friend, C, the later prosecution witness, who was at work, but said he would leave straight away and come over. When C arrived, he came in and tried to calm me down, making me go over every single detail of the conversation and asking me if I knew where Jack was, what else I could hear in the background, what was his tone of voice, etc. But I had no helpful answers to any of his questions. When John came home a couple of hours later, we all sat down with our map of Syria spread out in front of us and tried to overcome our shock and fear in order to work out what we could do now that our world had been blown apart. When I remember this now, I am both angry and astounded that one of the main thrusts of the subsequent police investigation against us has been the idea that we knew about or even encouraged Jack's departure for Syria. Here was the most devastating thing that had ever happened to us, and the police seemed bound and determined to prove that we had known about it all along. Why any parent would want their child to go to a war zone is absolutely beyond me, whatever their faith, creed, belief, or political outlook. To this day, I cannot work out what police achieve by criminalizing the victim. We were horrified, heartbroken, bewildered, and terrified that any moment our son could be killed. Yet the police seemed desperate to seize upon any shred of evidence that we had somehow connived in Jack's plan. Evidence such as my desperate emails to my friends, or the research books on Islam that John had downloaded onto his computer. The fact that on the day before Jack was due to fly to Jordan, we had dismissed the claims of Jack's friend C that Jack might be planning to go to Syria was one of the central planks of the police's case against us. According to the police, we had been warned by C about Jack's plans, yet failed to act, whereas we believe we knew our son better than C did, and if Jack promised he wasn't going to Syria at that particular time, then he wasn't.
Thank you, Sally. One of the things that really struck me is how your world really closed in on itself during this time period in terms of your ability to do daily banking or to go shopping. And I'm wondering, given the fact that a lot of people in Britain grew up on Monty Python and are probably familiar with Life of Brian and the expression, "Blessed are the cheesemakers," I understand that the actual manufacture of such dairy products falls under anti-terrorism legislation as well, and I'm just wondering if you have a reading about that.
Funnily enough, I do.
You do, eh? Oh, well, let's bring it on, shall we? Yeah.
Yeah, this story actually was first reported by Michelle Shepherd, a Canadian journalist who worked, she doesn't anymore, for the Toronto Star. And so this story has been sort of like knocking about for several years now. But anyway, it's still quite astounding when you hear the detail. Okay, so this was, the story was actually put out into the world by a Mail on Sunday journalist called David Rose. And David Rose was one of the very few journalists who did try to support us. And he even, the judge said he sailed close to the wind with one of his articles, because at the time the gag order was still in place, the contempt of court order. And so it was during that time that David managed to publish this article. So in my opinion, the best thing that David Rose did in his Mail on Sunday article of July 9th, 2016, was to highlight the unique role of cheese in terrorism. We can safely assume that approximately 2 million people, represented by the circulation figures for the Mail on Sunday, are now aware of what they can and can't do with cheese if they don't want to run foul of anti-terrorism legislation. Take note in case you're ever in this position. The story he recounted goes like this. John and I were worryingly short of money because of everything that had happened to us in the past year or so. Not only had I lost my job at the NHS, we also had legal bills to pay, and our housing benefit payments had been stopped while Oxford City Council investigated us for benefit fraud over the previous 5 years. Their investigation had been at the instigation of the police, who seemed determined to crush us. As it turned out, the fraud allegation was eventually dropped, although the council still instructed us to pay back thousands of pounds of alleged overpayments. As David reported, our friends were aware of our dire financial situation, and some of them offered to help. Both John and I are quite proud people and found it embarrassing to be so nakedly poverty-stricken. We had been portrayed by the Daily Mail as a middle-class couple, yet we couldn't even pay our rent. Pride, however, tends to take a back seat when you are desperate and need to keep a roof over the head of your second teenage son, so we gratefully accepted offers of assistance. One such offer came from John's friends, Jill and Simon, who run a farm in West Dorset. Simon was the high-profile editor of The Land magazine, and Jill was well known as an artist for environmental causes. They'd been shocked at our personal and legal dilemma, and in an email to John, offered financial help. The next thing they knew, because of course all our emails, etc., all our communications were being monitored in real time, two Sec2 Southeast Counterterrorism Unit, two Sec2 counterterrorism officers appeared on their doorstep and questioned them for a number of hours about their relationship with us and their views on Islamic terrorism. Jill took one of them on a tour of the farm. He said the problem was Muslims in the UK don't trust the police, she reported back to us. Can't imagine why. The police told Simon and Jill they were forbidden to assist us with any money, including helping us with the rent. If they did, they could be arrested as accomplices to terrorism. What if we pay the money directly to the landlord? Asked Jill. This was still unacceptable, came the reply, since this would free up funds that John and I could then use for terrorism. Gobsmacked by this logic, Simon and Jill asked if it would still be acceptable to give us cheese. John and they used to have an arrangement whereby he gave them his waste grain to feed their chickens in return for their handmade cheese. The Sec2 officer granted this exception as long as John and Sally don't sell the cheese, and allowed the concession to be inserted into the document the police asked them to sign. When I heard the story from John, I was shocked, bewildered, and angry at the absurdity of it all. It sounded like a comedy sketch. How could anti-terrorism police keep a straight face when writing documents about the potential dangers of unregulated cheese? A version of the Monty Python fish dance popped into my mind, in which instead of using flat fish to, I don't know if you know this scene, in which instead of using flat fish to slap each other on the face, the dancers used slabs of fresh mozzarella. Of all my emotions, it was anger that won out. All I wanted to do was get the hell out of this country as soon as I could, as how could I possibly live somewhere where police decided whether our friends were permitted to give us cheese.
Wow.
Even Maher shaking his head.
We have one more reading from you, Sally, and I think this reading speaks not only to the role of the police, but also the role of the bureaucracy and how they operate outside of the bounds of the law. And I'm wondering if you can share what that was like for you to be meeting with these consular officials and what they said, and I believe you've got a reading about that as well.
Actually,
Yeah.
yes. This is the reading. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Yes. This is the reading about our visit to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. And believe me, that all the stereotypes you think about Foreign Service, they're all true. Okay, I won't do the. I talk about the lovely architecture, but which I won't go into. But okay, in the first meeting, John and I were not there to admire the architecture. We were there to ask consular officials why they couldn't help us. I'd warned John that if they said we advise against all travel to Syria one more time, I wouldn't be responsible for my actions. As the consular assistant poured the tea into the finest bone china cups and offered us expensive chocolate biscuits, it occurred to me we might as well still be living in the days of the Raj, where 4 o'clock tea time was unfailingly maintained, even when the horrors of the Indian mutiny raged on. Certainly in that moment, Syria seemed another world away, and I had the absurd thought that it would be considered rude to even bring the subject up. John had no such qualms, of course, and launched into a series of heated questions about the government's failure to act. Did they know that Jack currently feared he was losing his mind and believed he had experienced what he said was universally considered a mental breakdown? I knew that Jim Collins, the consular officer, indeed did know about it, as it had prompted our meeting here in the first place. When I'd received Jack's message on June 25th that he was being kept in a dungeon in solitary confinement, he'd been shouting at himself like a crazy person and had punched the wall of his cell until his hand bled. I'd phoned the emergency line of the FCO in a screaming and sobbing panic. This had achieved the effect of this instantly arranged face-to-face meeting, unlike our previous polite letters, which had produced no response whatsoever. John asked the Foreign Office what the Foreign Office intended to do about the situation. Both Jim and his assistant were regretful that there was nothing they could do. They hadn't even had confirmation about Jack's whereabouts. Had they asked their Iraqi contacts for information about him? Yes, said the FCO, they had. And had this produced a response? Unfortunately not. John then repeated the same question about, where he actually did a Jeremy Paxman. Jeremy Paxman is a journalist in England who's known for asking the same question 47 times to a politician until he answered. Anyway, so John did a Jeremy Paxman on the consular official. And the assistant finally admitted that although British consular officers had asked their Iraqi colleagues about Jack, the latter had not actually passed on the query to their Syrian contacts. This is John speaking. What is the position of the ministers on Jack's situation? FCO. We cannot comment on this since our role is to produce recommendations which ministers will or will not take up as appropriate. John. Is there any will on the part of the ministers to assist anyone in returning from Syria? FCO. At this stage, there is no policy in place to address the issue of Syrian returnees. As you know, we advise against all travel to Syria and have done so since 2012. This is quite long. Do you want the rest of the story?
What happened at the end?
At the end, okay. At that point, my boiling rage would not allow me to stay in the room without doing something violent, flinging the tray of bone china cups to the floor, perhaps. I stormed out, leaving John to deal with the regretful Jim Collins, who, it turned out, had managed to secure himself an OBE, no doubt for his admirable stonewalling abilities. In the face of tricky political situations, the government would rather ignore. I realized after a few moments that the assistant was trotting behind me, presumably to make sure I left the building without hitting someone. As she and I took the lift down together, I broke my furious silence by asking her how she could possibly do her job, given that her job was to do absolutely nothing. She didn't reply. A year and a half later, when we received disclosure from the FCO after our Freedom of Information request, we learned that Jim Collins had judged this on elevator comment of mine to his assistant to be unkind. Just as well she wasn't being locked in a dungeon with no food, company or hope, since Jim Collins' Foreign Office vocabulary would never have been able to rise to the occasion.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. One final question, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. You've been in Canada for 4 years now. Have you had a single meeting with the Minister of Global Affairs or anyone at Global Affairs who apparently understand you can get to in about 10 minutes from your place?
Yeah, I have asked countless times. I've lost track of the number of times that I've asked to meet them, and they appear to be very scared of me. They have refused to meet. Unfortunately, my own MP has also refused to meet. It's a blank wall. I just can't get beyond it. I get stock paragraphs. I've been getting the same stock paragraphs for 7 years now. It's either we have no consular assistance, it's too dangerous to go there, very aptly disproved by Alex and the rest of the delegation. What's the other one they give me? Oh, they're trying to ascertain Jack's whereabouts, which they haven't known for the past 7 years, which the UN has told them is enforced disappearance. But no, they refuse to meet.
Do you think that some of this is bureaucratic baffle gab to hide the fact that they are afraid that you might try and leave unauthorized cheese at Global Affairs headquarters?
Well, if there are any CSIS people in the audience, yeah, it's hard to know. I suspect they know they have no evidence. We've been told there's no evidence. They have no plan. They want to string this out as long as possible. I don't know how it is possible to string this out any longer than it already has been.
So we have a couple minutes for questions from audience, and then Sally's going to sign books, and you can purchase your books. But if you've got any questions for Sally, Monia, or Alex, please do. Martin, yes.
Sally or Alex, the Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah.
Where's it at?
Sure. So I guess I mentioned 2 of the court rulings. There had been the very encouraging and very impressive initial federal court ruling, then the disgraceful and dismal reversal of that by the Federal Court of Appeal. The Bolo families, including Sally, sought leave to appeal that ruling to the Supreme Court of Canada. I don't think there's a legal commentator or academic in the country who thought that the Supreme Court would refuse leave. It's the kind of case that screams out for Supreme Court attention. It's a novel legal issue. It's got significant consequences. The decisions in the courts below were split, but they did. They refused. So, you know, for those of you who may or may not know what that means, it's not, you're not even allowed in the door to have the appeal. So, unfortunately, it means that the Federal Court of Appeal ruling is what has won the day so far.
And has anyone ever put together a tape montage of Ralph Goodale when he was a public security minister, and he said, we are eager to have these people come back to Canada to face due process, and then the day after, Andrew Scheer stood in the House of Commons and called him Jihadi Jack, and the panty wedding that went on among the Liberal caucus. Like it changed overnight.
Yeah. No, I don't know if the photo montage exists, but that's clearly it. There was that brief moment where what we were hearing from Ralph Goodale and others was the right thing.
Come back
was exactly the human rights compliant, the charter compliant response, and then, as you point out, they got cold feet.
The Supreme Court refusal, they don't give a reason for refusal.
No, they don't.
Because they could probably argue that it's not in their purview to tell the government and to put an onus on the government to do something, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, no, you don't get any reasons.
No.
And therefore you don't know if they actually had some sort of principled reason as to why they felt that it didn't merit their attention, or whether it was just they didn't want to take on a political hot potato, or whether it was just docket control. They felt they had too many cases pending and therefore didn't want to take on one that was going to be demanding.
But it even flies in the face of their ruling on Maher Arar in terms of Canada having obligations under the Constitution.
That was Omar Khadr.
Omar Khadr, sorry, Maher Arar, yeah. Omar Khadr,
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot of Canadian jurisprudence that is very helpful in this area, and we saw that in that we had a federal court judge who's the one who spent the most time with the case, who heard extensive evidence. He even heard evidence behind closed doors. You know, so obviously an opportunity for the government to give their best crack at it. But in a 100+ page ruling, he very clearly came down on the side of human rights and that the Charter did apply here.
So how many Canadians have been brought back? 23 women, was it? Or 14 women? Or
27.
You have the tally, right?
Yep.
Yeah, but not a single man.
Yeah, and that was because of some legal work by a certain lawyer making a side deal, or was it just pure politics? Or
Well, so the bulk of the returns came about through, I think Matthew described it, the night before that federal court ruling was coming out. And the government, I think, was reading the tea leaves. Things hadn't gone well for them. You predict judges at your peril. I've been burned many times thinking the judge is on board by the nature of their questions, and then you get an awful ruling, and vice versa. But I think people felt quite confident that in this instance the judge was on board, and obviously the government felt so as well, and so they decided to cut a deal just before the ruling came out. So there obviously had to be some mad scrambling on the judge's part, because the ruling was already drafted, and it had to be revised to take out, because the women and children were no longer part of the case. So it had to be rewritten to apply only to the 4 men.
just one last question, because I don't want to dominate things, but what do you make of where things stand now after what happened in Israel and Palestine? How does that affect the whole template that you're now working under? Because people's attention now is riveted in a different way. There's all sorts of cross currents now. There's so much anger.
Well, I'll say one very concrete piece of that is in the weeks, the days and weeks immediately after our delegation was back, we went out on a full court press. Within, I think, 18 hours of being back in the country, we had very senior meetings at the Department of Foreign Affairs. One of the other delegates is a retired Canadian ambassador, so he carried a fair bit of cachet over there as well. We then moved from that meeting into a national press conference on Parliament Hill, which got quite a bit of pickup. And we started to pretty quickly sense a different tone and tenor in our exchanges, especially with anyone in foreign affairs who was involved in consular work, including some senior people within the department, who, of course, for years had been simply repeating the excuses. I think Sally repeated a long list of them as to, it's too dangerous to go, it's too complicated to go, all sorts of reasons as to, so they were very practiced at giving the here's why we're doing nothing response. And then suddenly we were having very different exchanges with them around almost even seeking our advice and input as to how they might go about doing this themselves, kind of almost travel advice and that sort of thing. And then, and I think it was starting to give us some cautious optimism, not necessarily that the dial had moved significantly on the big question of repatriation, but on that immediate concern of getting some consular support and assistance onto the ground, that maybe we were about to see a different strategy. And then to go to your question, Martin, October the 7th hit. And just in very practical terms, I think as everyone knows, especially when you think about those early weeks, 200% of every single available consular resource that the department had was fully deployed. First, of course, on the evacuations from Israel, and then the much more challenging and politically contentious and less impressive evacuations out of Gaza, and of course there's still issues ongoing there. So in very practical terms, yes, we did lose that attention. We're still in touch. I even just about maybe 10 days ago had another meeting with someone in Consular, and we're hoping that we can kind of get them back into the spirit of those exchanges in September. But right now it feels like that has kind of closed down a bit.
Is any other country doing the right thing? I mean, can you use any other country as leverage? I mean, you can shame the Canadian government to say, look, well, you mentioned Kazakhstan or whoever it was, but...
No, there's lots of countries that have brought, and of course Canada has brought back some, right? So we're not totally out of the picture here either. It doesn't feel like Canada's very shameable here, and part of it is there is shame more widely. I mean, we aren't the only country that has a disgraceful response here. I mean, you've heard how the UK has been handling things, right? So there's shame to go around, which I think makes it harder to kind of really embarrass Canada here. But I think we obviously need to continue to highlight the shortcomings.
Any other questions for our panel? No, yes.
What should I do? Like what, you're all really good at what you're doing, but I'm so frustrated and I just, what can I do? And when I say I mean all of us.
Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, you can keep selling Sally's book.
Yeah, buy the book.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm trying to imagine the conversations that I'm having with my friends, and their eyes are glazing over. And nobody, I mean, I've talked about Hassan Diab, and I'm like, it could be you, it could be me, it could be anybody. And, in the same way that Justin Trudeau has not said, we're not gonna send him back, it could be any of us, and that, you said that again today. Like, I could go to Hawaii and break my leg and not be able to get back, and nobody has to come and help me. We all walk around with our privilege and assumption that the right thing's going to happen, but maybe it's not. And I don't want to feel frustrated, but I would like to feel like I can do something. And I would like us, you can't all sell this book because you don't all have a bookstore, I do. But what can we all do? And, because, I'm sure I can write to my MP, I can write to my city councilor, I can write to, but I get the same email back every time. And sometimes I say, oh, I think maybe you sent me the wrong email, and then they're, oh, sorry, and then they'll send me a slightly different email. But, I mean, I feel like there has to be something that, isn't there? What can he do? What can I do? Anybody?
I mean, I would appreciate people writing to Melanie Joly because I write and I give them more information. We've been told that in order to be eligible for extraordinary assistance to come back, because there is this framework policy that supposedly is in play that can be triggered by certain factors. And the factors are you have to prove that the situation of your loved one has deteriorated since they implemented their policy, which was in January 2021, which they didn't tell us about until November 2021. And so the fact that Jack was being mistreated before January 2021 is of no consequence because it's not since they implemented their policy. Unfortunately now we're in a position where it's impossible to, before Alex and the others went out in August, it was actually impossible to prove anything because no access was allowed to the prison. Even the Red Cross has not been allowed to visit the prisons in the last 2.5 years. And so we didn't know if Jack was alive before Alex and the rest of the delegation went out there. There was no way of finding out. The government said, we do have a channel of communication with the Kurds, but because I said, well, how would I know if he's not alive? you know, would you tell me? And they said this channel of communication, they couldn't guarantee that that would tell me if he was no longer alive. I mean, how can we be in the 21st century in a modern world with instant communications when you can tweet something and it goes to 1 million people around the world and not be told if your son is dead or alive, who is being held by your allies on your behalf for your convenience?
And being interrogated regularly by the FBI.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, the consular policy that Sally has referred to, which has this ridiculous long title, the Government of Canada Policy Framework to Evaluate the Provision of Extraordinary Assistance, Consular Cases in Northeastern Syria. Specifically, so supposedly it's meant to be a policy that, okay, here's how and when we'll help. But it's very notable that in the opening passages of the policy, they repeat, the Government of Canada has no positive obligation under domestic or international law to provide consular assistance, including repatriation, to Canadian citizens in distress abroad, at an individual's request. And this is pursuant to the government's royal prerogative over international relations. So they've gone out of their way yet again, even in this one framework that's supposedly offering, here's Sally's faint glimmer of hope that we might, in extraordinary circumstances, provide some assistance. But we're going to tell you once again, we don't have to. There's no obligation. This is totally discretionary.
I actually don't understand this. Like, you go, you have a meeting with somebody, and you're like, you know, here's the facts. And they're just, well, I don't know. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry, I apologize.
But I mean,
Okay,
to pick up on one, Melanie, should I think absolutely.
Should I be writing yes or not?
Your MP is Sally's MP, so yes. She's already told you that he's not met with her. I think that's very important.
I'm going to lose my mind, sir.
Well,
It's
ask
fun.
him to meet with her.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny you say nothing has to make sense. I'm not sure if you carry that title by Shireen Razak, but nothing has to make sense is her explanation of how Islamophobia is part of the official discourse. Nothing has to make sense, which is why if you buy a fax machine and you are Muslim, you can be held under a security certificate, for example. Another thing that folks are starting to look at doing, which we did on Valentine's Day, is we went to Global Affairs with that banner up there and handed out flyers. And Sally, I don't know if you want to speak to the fact that we actually spoke to a couple of people who worked at Global Affairs, and what was their response?
You mean the security guard?
There were security guards at
yes.
first, but then there were actual employees.
Yes. There was one young intern that stopped by, because, what are you doing here with a large, she was, you know, curious, large banner. And apparently there were some people looking out of the windows as well, because it was freezing cold last Wednesday, so what are these mad people doing, minus 16 below. So she asked the question, and she responded positively. It seems to be that those sort of small human contact moments seem to be much more valuable than me ranting on Twitter for 7 years, which gets me absolutely nowhere. Because those people talk to other people who talk to other people, and you're hoping that this kind of like spread, this sort of message spread via people, if not from me writing letters that never got answered.
If I may add here something, have been thinking about your question, Lisa, what can we do, what can we do? And I remember years after my husband came back, I met a Canadian who told me, I heard you talk on the current. I heard you talk on this. So I think, and they said that convinced me. I felt that, I felt how important it is to really talk to my neighbor, to my friends about that. I think get Sally to be interviewed by, we still have, I think the radio, the TV, they still have a lot of impact on people. So get her story, especially that you have your story written here. by media. I mean, it can be sometimes difficult to get into the mainstream media, but there are podcasts happening right now, and if Sally can get there, if we know anyone who can be, you know, get Sally invited and get her story out there. I think we don't need those obstacles, you know. They are the one who, I mean, the government, the politician, they are the one who are preventing her story to go to. You have to have this direct contact, I guess, with the Canadian.
Yeah. We have time for one more question. Yes.
Where's the Jagmeet Singh and the NDP and all of this?
Does anyone, Sally, do you want to address the role of the NDP at this point?
Yes, we did have Heather McPherson, the foreign critic for the NDP, come out publicly on behalf of the women and children. She was quite vocal about that. She's less vocal, in fact, I don't think she actually has mentioned the men, has she? Because the men are not, you know, seen to be popular or sympathetic in the way that women and children are, regardless of what they have or haven't done. So they've been wary on that part. Jagmeet Singh actually has made a supportive statement, but in the French press, not in the English press. And I'm not quite sure what the rationale behind that is. Yeah, I mean, we're hoping, I mean, if anybody is politically is going to support us, like the Green, Elizabeth May has supported us, and so has a member, an MP from the Parti Québécois. So, you know, if those people can get together and put pressure on the Liberals and the Conservatives, then...
And it's worth also noting that one of the members of our delegation was a senator, Senator Kim Pate, who many of you will know here in Ottawa. So we have a bit of parliamentary support over in the other chamber.
One of the things I was going to say is I'm in a former existence, I was a journalist, and one of the biggest things for me was reading your book, because it's a complex issue. And journalists have, literally there's no journalists with any jobs anymore. It's a horrible, you know, it's a trade where people don't have time, they don't have resources, and so they're not going to have the inclination. The book, it's a complex issue. And even myself as a journalist, you have to make so many decisions about what you're covering at any given day. But the book answers so many questions in a human way and shows the human side of the complexity, because everyone's been served the jihadi jack, right? The poison Kool-Aid. And when Andrew Scheer got up, he was the first one to, you say it in question period, I remember watching it. And the moment that came out of his mouth in Canadian question period, I said, shit, this is a problem. That book has done so much. If you could have a budget to send one to each and every MP, because it's a complex issue, as you know, and there's so many people have so many your questions tried to get to the point of, okay, is he to blame, right? Because we blame him. It's his fault he's there. We blame you. It's your fault that he went and all that. And you address it so well in the book, because it's a constant theme, because that's what you've had to live. And the book does so much for even a hardened heart like my own. It just shows you the human side of it and how these things are complex. And I just can't say enough about that.
I think that's something that we could do. I think that could be like a fundraising campaign that Octopus does, and we like try to get people to...
Yeah, because the book itself is so compelling. It's
like donate the money for a book, we're sending them on this day. I think that's a great idea. I don't know if that was your idea or mine, but it's a good idea.
Yeah. Sounds great. And this is the first night of a 10-city book tour. Yeah. So Sally's going to be taking this message across Eastern Ontario and Southern Ontario over the next month. So this is really the first public event we've ever done about this for a variety of reasons, and there's going to be a lot more. We're going to be doing a monthly vigil at Global Affairs, so there is a sign-up sheet, so if you'd like to be kept in touch, you can sign that up. There's a donations basket, speaking of which, because we need to pay for our transportation costs as we hit out on the road. Don't worry, we won't be staying at the Deluxe. And we really want to thank Octopus for being such a strong supporter of this. And we want to thank the Unitarians for hosting an event which I think a lot of folks in this city still might be a bit wary of. Please come forward, sir.
My name is Bill Van Eiderson. I'm a member of this congregation. I'm a member of the Justice and Equality Action Group, which is one of a number of social action groups in this congregation that are concerned about a number of issues. And we're very happy to have the opportunity to host this event this evening. And I'd like to thank a few parties. Maybe I should start with thanking you all for coming out and being here. Certainly I learned a great deal this evening. This is interesting because we never hear about this issue really. Occasionally there's a little bit on page 17. No, it's not 79. It's only page 9 because there's only 9 pages in the paper. But you know, in a little hidden spot, there'll be a little something that nobody pays any attention to. But this is a really important issue, and it's great to have the opportunity. And thank you for helping us learn. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Octopus, for promoting the book, and especially I'd like to thank all of our speaker, Matthew Behrens, who didn't quite introduce himself, but that's Matthew Behrens, and thank you for your role. We really appreciated the sort of the historical setting that you created, and the dialogue that you conducted, and the introductions you provided for everybody. That was contributed a lot to the evening. And Alex, Neve, and the work you're doing, and Monia and Sally. I thought I was going to come and thank you for your talk this evening, but I'm going to thank you for that. I'm going to thank you more. I'm going to thank you for the people you are. I'm going to thank you for your courage and your determination, because this is just a little sample of what you folks have been doing a lot of the days in your lives, and contributing to our society, and it's terrifically important, and we all appreciate it. So thank you. As Matthew said, there's a list at the back there where you can sign up so people know who you are and can get in touch with you about these issues. There's a basket there in which you can contribute some greenbacks, and so if you'd like to do that, you can do that, and here are the books. So,
get yourself a book, a signed copy. Yes, indeed.